Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Paul. He gives me the salute, and then the audio-only listeners are left in the dark. I like that.
Hi.
Paul.
How you doing, man?
Would you like to introduce the show? I'm going to put the reins in your hands for a minute.
You're listening to Out of the Blank, and I am this week's guest. Or is it today's guest? How often do you have guests?
I do a daily show, but
it's daily. That's incredible.
That's how I got to 900.
That's amazing.
It's
Salute
tiring
to you, sir.
It's tiring. It's like being in social media for 5 minutes. It's like, when you sit in a pool for too long, your hands get all pruny. This is like that, but 10 times the speed.
but you're learning by doing, right? I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely getting better at it, but I think through the last time it's been a while. It's been about almost a year and a half, hasn't it? Or maybe shorter.
Yeah, I think something like that.
Any big changes? You've gone keto. Yeah. That's a keto sigh. What?
A keto sigh?
Like keto diet? That sigh that you had. That's a keto sigh. That means when they're tired and they need meat and they're like, I'm keto. I can't.
No, I eat loads of meat. Well, I mean, I eat quite a lot of meat because I've always been someone who goes to the gym, and getting protein through dairy does not agree with me at all.
Those protein farts are the worst, aren't they?
Protein stomach, man. Lactose is not my friend. So yeah, I eat a fair amount of meat. Although I'm kind of a guilty meat eater. Like as someone with a background and undergrad in environmental science, I kind of understand the numbers to a degree of the impact of meat and the meat industry on the production of greenhouse gas and stuff like that, and just energy use in general. So I generally eat white meat. There you go. There's a little tidbit.
I like it. I mean,
it's nothing to do with Egyptology.
I live in a beach town and I mostly eat fish, but hey, that's the point of the show, is we don't focus on one thing. We like to go around the board. But I did have, like I told you before, I have a conspiracy little thing that recently, I think a lot of the world has focused either on TikTok videos or other things, but I came across this page of like Egypt history, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I like Egypt stuff, and I like pyramids, and I think everyone wants to know how they built. And much like you've shattered my illusions in our first episode, as they weren't built by aliens, I was like, damn. But I found a new method. All right, so buckle up for this one. So the pictures of the hieroglyphics are them carrying the blocks, but the blocks look like normal sized blocks. But then you examine the pyramids, the blocks are huge. So were they 900 feet tall? What is it? And like the hallways that they have, and they have them walking in through the doorways. Were they just taller? They could barely fit through them. So it was like a normal hallway. And then to us, they're like mountains. I don't know. Maybe that's a crazy thought.
Yeah, that's a bunch of crazy thoughts.
The internet never lies to me.
Dude, the average Egyptian was from all the remains, human remains that have been discovered. The average Egyptian was around 5 feet tall, maybe 5.5 feet if they were particularly tall. We have a couple that are 6 foot or would have been around 6 foot. I think Ramesses II is one of those. Seti I might be another as well, which makes sense because they're directly related. So yeah, they were around 5 feet tall. The whole lifting blocks thing's a really interesting controversy. And actually what I should have done is looked back at, I did a whole course on this, on how the pyramids were built a little while ago. And basically, yes, there are a few depictions of them kind of lifting the blocks or using sledges to move monuments and things like that. And on those, so to answer directly your question about the size of the blocks to start with, the blocks in the pyramid vary in size, and it's the foundational blocks that are obviously the biggest. They're also the blocks that they had to lift the least high, So you've got the quarry. We've got all the records from the quarry, which was like just down the ways of where all the limestone blocks came from. The conspiracy theorists like to dismiss that as anecdotal evidence, or that's just the quarry where the limestone casing came from and stuff like that. And it's like, well, no, there's a huge limestone quarry just down the ways for where all of the casing and internal blocks have come from. So you've got the fine Tura limestone, which is where a lot of the casing comes from, and then you've got the more generic kind of yellow limestone that we see on the pyramids, which came from just down the ways. And we've got records and stuff like that. And one of the biggest finds that kind of helped figure this out. Because just before anyone kind of switches their brain off and goes, oh, this guy's just a traditional Egyptologist, I spent my entire Egyptological career questioning the orthodoxy and looking for the evidence that made things fit. I came at it from coming in to the field from like an alternative Egyptology background, and then became an Egyptologist per se, through kind of studying the academia and doing the PhD and stuff like that. But at no point was I required to sign off, on a belief system that says, oh, you have to believe that this is the way we did it. I just looked at all the evidence, and it actually really adds up very well. The city of the pyramid builders was one of the most comprehensive things. It helps tie everything together. It helps kind of collaborates the evidence between how many blocks were being shifted by different work groups, how many different work groups they had, the number of those work groups. They all had different work group names. And we kind of start building this picture of how these people were living, how much work they were doing, how many people, and there was huge amounts of people involved. I'd have to actually look back at the scripts for the course to remember all the exact stats, but it's like, wow, this was a substantial city, city of the pyramid builders, it's called. And it's right next to the Giza Plateau. And you look a little crestfallen, like I'm shattering your illusions.
No, I'm thinking because when you were saying you're not like a strict like you weren't in the whole scientific, everyone wants to go to science, 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 and you didn't go into that. You're just looking at the basic facts of that. I think what the world right now is like academia is being torn down kind of in a way with science or whatever we consider fact. There is no science anymore. And that's with a lot of what the internet really has the capability to offer, is that even a conspiracy person will dig deeper and deeper into something where they can get a bunch of information where you can pull out some hot button topics out of some things. I've talked to a few people and I never even understood the idea of the Younger Dryas theory, but then that's now been brought to my attention more than one time by maybe if that's considered, I don't know if that's considered fact or if that's just considered a theory out there that I know Graham Hancock was like one of the main people behind that. I just find the conspiracy stuff so entertaining because as much as you got to draw the line, like when the earth becomes flat, but there's so much work that gets put into it where it's like admirable, where I'm like, I don't think in education anymore. I know we talk about degrees, for instance. Necessarily, there's a lot of people out there that might not have a degree from a school, and in some ways, there some of those people might have a wrong standard of teaching, or maybe a wrong tunnel that they dive down. But I see a lot of people getting like very valuable information and stuff like that, much like myself at times, where I'm able to pull and look into a topic and maybe watch a documentary on Netflix or something that, despite maybe some mild inaccuracies on some things, you really can get some information on this stuff as a whole. And I see this kind of even between the conspiracy people or someone that's studying Egyptology, they both have the same interest in the same thing as these amazing objects that have been created. I mean, that was the main thing that highlighted to me about that page. And then seeing that little idea that someone put out there is like, oh, maybe they were 900 feet tall. I was like, it's a good thought, but I think it gets you interested in digging more into it because the first thing I did when I left that page was I Googled, like, is this shit real? And I started looking into it. I was like, okay, it's not. But I thought I would pick your brain on this topic because there's a lot of ideas of what these things were created for, what a mirage is. Um, and I don't know. I want to hear your thoughts on it coming from an actual field of study that focuses in on this. That's a deep breath again. Another keto sigh.
Isn't the keto diet all about having fats and teaching your body how to preferentially burn fat, so you're eating a lot more meat, I thought, on keto than you were if you weren't? I don't know. I've not tried keto personally. I've just heard people like Mark Sisson talk about it on Health Theory and shows like that.
I stopped
But
following diet trends when Adkins slipped and fall and cracked his head open, and I was like, well, apparently you need some meat at some times.
well, to get into that with you, look, information hates a vacuum, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and where a vacuum is perceived, it's usually just perceived. Like, I think part of the problem of academia, and this is something that I address particularly in the book I wrote, Profane Egyptologists, was I was kind of antagonizing or deconstructing, how naive we were, the boundaries of Egyptology and how it interacted with the other, so the alternative person, the person on the fringe, how we as a field responded to alternative Egyptology back at the millennium, which, 20 years ago, actually 22 years ago now, which many listeners may not remember, but there was a whole kind of hoo-ha around the Giza Plateau about, a chamber of secrets was going to be found under the paws of the Sphinx, or something was going to happen at the pyramid or at the turn of the millennium, because Edgar Cayce had these visions. And there was a lot made out of little from authors such as, Hancock and Bauval and people like that. And I've read their stuff. I've met some of them. I used to go to the Questing conference back in the late 90s and spoke with a bunch of people there. And their theories are interesting and exciting, and they sell books. And a lot of them tend to kind of work from a conclusion. We've got this idea that this is the case, and now we're going to look for stuff that fits it. And the real sad thing is that if we could actually, instead of sitting down and being antagonistic, this has always been part of my approach, instead of just sitting down and being antagonistic with each other, if we just sat and had a moderated conversation where people weren't bringing in preconceived ideas, but were literally just looking at the evidence in front of them, then we would solve a lot of these things very, very quickly. You've got people on YouTube now, I won't call them out by name, but getting millions and millions of views just by expressing their opinions on, the pyramids and how they couldn't have been built by human beings and stuff like that, right? And then you've got archaeologists who've been kind of trying to be science communicators, basically, I guess, or archaeology communicators for the last kind of 15 years, getting a fraction of those views and not getting their message across, which was, let's just kind of look to the evidence a lot of the time. Now, look, that's not to say that academia doesn't have its problems. It does. Academia itself has been kind of dragged into a political miasma of problems nowadays, but archaeology itself is going through some real shifts over here as well. Like there are archaeology departments, like departments shutting down and kind of funding disappearing, and so positions just evaporating into the ether. And so what academia is struggling in Egyptology is a small field. And that's something that we need to remember. There's, I think, a misconception on both sides. There's a misconception of the Egyptologist being in control of the narrative and somehow being this culturally significant or powerful figure, which we're not. There's this other kind of idea or concept, which is equally as broken, of the heroic alternative archaeology truth seeker who's just there for the to bust the mystery and bring the people the truth and kind of bust open this false construction created by these warped conservative Egyptologists. And it's like, well, most Egyptologists I've met aren't at all conservative, and they're just as curious as anyone else. They're curious enough that they've put their money where their mouth is and gone and studied this crap, despite the fact there's no freaking jobs in the field anymore. And yet nobody wants to listen when we come back and say, hey, look, we've got a ton of complementary evidence here that suggests that these people in this period built these things this way. We can see an evolution of how they were built if we look back to the old mastaba, which is like it's an Arabic word for bench, which is an old form of tomb that comes from the pre-dynastic times. And they started building the mastaba out of mud brick. They moved on to building them out of stone. Eventually it was granite. All of these were security features. All of these were an evolution of a design and technology based on a need to protect the centralized wealth of the king. This is what it comes back to: political power and wealth, economics, always. And as we go through time, we see, yes, ritualistic aspects get linked to this very pragmatic response to tomb robbers. Okay, not just tomb robbers as well. I mean, why do we bury people 6 feet underground? So they're not dug up by dogs and eaten. Yeah, so that we don't see our loved ones' remains sprawled all over the ground while dogs eat their liver and kidneys. All right, that's why we bury people. Sorry, I'm on a rant, but like, I just want to get to the end of this point anyway. So what we've got, and what I found when I was researching the kind of evolution of pyramids and tombs and looking at all of the research and evidence that had been done, was that there's a really kind of obvious, when you look at it, linear evolution of the technology needed to build a pyramid by just looking at the mastaba and looking at how it grew. Now, the most famous example of that is the step pyramid of Djoser. And then after that, you get Sneferu, a dynasty later, going, okay, I've seen a step pyramid, which is a mastaba on top of a mastaba on top of a mastaba on top of a mastaba. It's loads of these benches built up into one thing. Yeah. And it vaguely resembles a pyramid, but it's not a true pyramid yet. It's just a stack of mastabas, which are supposedly going to protect the king's tomb from anyone digging down into the top of them, right? And Sneferu comes along and goes, I want to make a true pyramid that's smooth. I want you to fill that out. So let's figure out a way to build this thing so that it goes up, but we can cover it and stuff. And just during his reign alone, we see him attempt this and fail numerous times. And yet, when you look at the books written by the alternative camp, by and large, they will come out with egregious statements such as the pyramid comes from nowhere. Hieroglyphs appeared out of nowhere. And it's like, no, they didn't. You just don't know where the evidence is. You're not looking at the evidence. You don't want to find that evidence. You actively, if you get that evidence put in front of you, try to dismiss it or bring it into your own narrative instead of just trying to objectively assess it and go, well, how do humans do stuff in our experience? And that's the job of an archaeologist. It's to go, all right, how do humans do stuff? And what's the evidence for how these things came about, rather than what do we think about these things and what narrative do we need to create in order to fit that narrative that we're trying to, build for people. And it sells books. And it gets YouTube clicks, and it makes people fortunes to create and spin mythology and stories around this that aren't necessary, because these things have, unfortunately, in a rather pedestrian way, kind of been explained. Even if we don't have a blueprint for a pyramid, there's a very good understanding of how they evolved and why they evolved the way they did. So
I have a couple points. First on the clicks of how the pyramids, the fantastical, whatever fantasy ideas of how they're built gets more clicks on YouTube. My buddy has a flat Earth episode, and then I have an actual astrophysicist come on my show and talk about it. But more people like the flat Earth episode because they enjoy the ideas behind it. They enjoy that it's going to get, and that's just the world we're in. Is a lot of people want to know the craziest thing possible. That's what they want to see, crazy things on a TikTok. They want to see crazy things on YouTube. My whole push for is why I'm not a conspiracy person at all, but I entertain the ideas for sure. Mostly because it's a way of getting someone interested into a topic, but it also, there is the conspiracy people that just, even when they see the evidence, when it's right in front of them, they don't want to back down from their position. They want to
yeah,
keep going and just go blind to the evidence. And that's when it becomes more toxic. For me, I have friends that'll tell me dinosaurs don't exist. And they'll be on an episode telling me that. And I'm like, all right, well, I know paleontologists, so I'll talk to them. I talk to them. They tell me here's all the reasons why it all does exist. It's because right behind me is a fucking dinosaur and he's in a museum and he points at it. Then when the flat earth thing comes up, I talk to an astrophysicist. When someone brings up an idea about the pyramids, I used to, like, someone told me that nobody was actually buried inside of the pyramids. Now, I don't know too much about that, but that's what I thought was their final resting place, was in the pyramid with all of these nice things that they belong to.
hey, you want to know why people say that no one was buried in a pyramid?
Never
It's because
found
they
it.
were all robbed in antiquity, but remains have been found in pyramids.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, they have. And like, even though some of those remains uh, were later were later kind of kings and queens being buried into what we know are older pyramids, it's like they usurped that burial place. And it makes you wonder, well, if it wasn't meant for burial, why would later generations have wanted to usurp it in the first place? But also, um, there are abandoned pyramids as well. So obviously no one was buried in them because they were never finished. So that's one of those things that comes up again and again. Why has no one ever been found in the pyramid? Actually, someone has. There was a princess found in a satellite pyramid. I think it was in Saqqara. Again, I'd have to double check. I wish I'd reread my notes on that course before we had this conversation, actually. But so there have been remains that seem to be contemporary, found in not one of the main pyramids, in another sister pyramid. This is the thing. There were satellite pyramids around those pyramids, which were made for the relatives of the deceased kings or pharaohs. So another question is, well, you know, what's the point of those if they're not for those burials? But again, if we approach the tomb security problem from a pragmatic standpoint, what we're seeing is their response to that problem was clearly the wrong one, because what they did was made it a bigger target, and those things got robbed. And so one of the questions that comes up is like, why were no more pyramids built, and why were they all inferior? Well, for one thing, there was a huge economic and social collapse at the end of the Pyramid Age, because the pharaohs had centralized power and wealth so much that the discrepancy had clearly become so great, and they had used so many resources to build these 3 freaking massive pyramids on the Giza plateau, let alone all the failed ones from the fourth dynasty, the third dynasty and the fourth dynasty. You know, it's just like there was this whole situation where the entire civilization was built around building pyramids, and it could not be sustained. It wasn't a sustainable model for a civilization. And Bruce Trigger kind of puts it in terms of a thermodynamic thing, where this is an energy output of a civilization to show how powerful they've become. The problem is they ended up spending all that energy and all their resources. Like the accounts that we have, we've got ledgers of what the pyramid builders were being paid and how they were being fed. And they were getting through thousands of cattle. Like they had these huge farming areas, and they're getting through all this meat, which wasn't a regular part of the Egyptian diet, obviously, because meat, as it was, is a fairly not sustainable thing on a kind of agrarian, like it has to be little and often rather than all meat all the time.
Yeah,
Again, not sustainable in
because
a
they
small
didn't. I guess
civilization,
did
right?
they not figure out salt yet to put salt on the food yet?
Food preservation that's a really good question, actually. I mean, they would have had access to salt, natron especially, because it was used for washing, and they knew how to preserve bodies. We know that from mummification. But again, that was trial and error. So I'm guessing they weren't making beef jerky around the time of the fourth dynasty. But
Damn
the
shame.
point being is just that, you know, the pyramids disappear. They become much smaller and less significant, and most of them are collapsed and lost and, you know, elsewhere. They're in different cult centers. And it's like, it's not that the Egyptians forgot, and it's not that someone else had come along and built them for them. It's that their civilization economically collapsed. There was no central authority or government for a long time, decades. And the techniques of building these things were not, there was, you know, there was no library back then. There was no set of blueprints for anyone to come along. This was all knowledge that had been developed by the state. That state had collapsed, and then they had to figure out and reverse engineer what they could see to keep doing what they were doing. But they equally didn't have the resources or even the human power, so to speak, if we put it in thermodynamic terms again. They didn't have access to those bodies of people again for a long time.
Yeah.
And then we see a different emphasis of that use in temples, and that's when the great temples start being created. So it opens up a different set of political and economic circumstances, you know?
Now you were mentioning before about the about the bodies. For instance, is it like the Great Wall of China? It was a symbol of something, but the amount of people that was take and like the amount of production energy that was put into using it, it took a long time to be able to finish off. But there was a lot of people that were just like it's kind of like the mummy where there are people buried into the walls. That's kind of like the Great Wall of China in a way. A lot of people died building this giant thing, which is what we have today. And then I'm guessing over through the conditions of Egypt and all the sand and wind that goes along just ended up degrading the pyramids down because there was nobody maintaining the buildings that were there. It just
Well,
was built.
there's two reasons for that. I mean, I don't think many remains have been found in the mortar of the pyramid, so to speak, but those pyramids were stripped for building materials, which is why they don't have the limestone casing anymore. And that's helped them degrade, because the stone underneath was not meant to be exterior stone. And that's why that's worn down. So,
So
yeah,
they were deteriorating because that someone stole the outside layer of the pyramids.
several generations of people stole the limestone from the outside of the pyramids. Yeah.
Is
Over
that is
multiple centuries.
did they know that's what would degrade it, or is it a concept of the value of those blocks?
Well, stone, I mean, pre-worked stone is useful. That stone had been quarried. So if you don't have to quarry stone, then that's advantageous. There are lots of reasons you would want to just take stone off an existing building rather than quarry it out and cut it down and try and make a straight line out of it yourself.
Yeah.
But also I'm guessing that, yeah, like the particular stones that were taken would have had some kind of value, be it direct value to your architectural needs or value in the sense of, oh, this is nice limestone, we can use this. A whole bunch of it is actually apparently in some of the earliest mosques and stuff like that underneath the Cairo city.
My brain went to like a different direction with like one of three ways. Is one that they were tearing it down and then selling it. Two is that they were salvaging it and using it on another building, much like if a kid has Legos and they're building something, they can take something from another contraption and add to that
Yep.
one. Or the third
Yep.
was, did they think they had the type of consciousness of the situation that they were in when it comes to the state's power and being able to tear down maybe like how we have civilizations that tear themselves down or they riot or they do some type of thing. Do you think that could be a possibility that they could have figured out, like, I don't want this built in honor of this guy, I want it taken down? And then that could have been something that might have been happening at the time.
That's a really good question, and it's an interesting question. I think we have to kind of be a little bit cautious in projecting our own societal attitudes on ancient people that we kind of have more limited information about. Obviously, some pharaohs, possibly most pharaohs, but certainly some pharaohs would have been tyrannical. And we're looking at centralized power with potentially quite a dictatorial hierarchy, right? And if that's the case, then it's entirely possible that when that power fell, when that centralized government fell, people would have gone, let's take this apart. But it seems like rather than try to destroy the pyramids, really like destroy them, because let's face it, that's a lot of work. The dismantling seems to have been more, like you say, scavenging for building materials for other things. I mean, it was valuable stone, you're right. And you could, if you were a farmer who was not doing well, or if you were a peasant and you kind of see these huge things with all this stone, if you can get enough people together to take some of that limestone off and sell it to the people who are now, going and building things, why wouldn't you?
Is it a
And then
possible?
later,
Okay.
sorry, Rob, go on.
I was saying, is it, if it's a possibility now, when they were tearing it down and maybe salvaging it for other parts, this couldn't have been why that dynasty or where that generation was still alive, right? Because if you see, maybe if they had a family member or someone that was a second up to the king who just died, and they put him into the tomb, you would see the pyramid being taken down, and you would probably raise hell and try and fight those people off. So maybe that happened later, or did it happen around the same time period?
It seems very likely that a lot of, well, we do have some accounts of destruction from the ancient world. I am not a walking library, unfortunately, so I can't remember these specific
I'm
periods that
sorry.
they're from.
I would have had you prep notes or something. I
No,
didn't think
no,
I was
it's
going to
okay.
ask these questions. I'm like super interested into this.
Oh, it's just the way it kind of tumbles out sometimes. But yeah, it's something I haven't thought about for a little while. But there are accounts of chaos and disorder in the first intermediate period, and they're mostly from, well, they have to be from semi-nobles because they can write. Your average commoner couldn't write. I mean, we're talking about maybe possibly 1% of the population could read and write in ancient Egypt. So if people are leaving records saying there's chaos and disorder, those people are nobles, more than likely, because they're the only people who would have had the resources and the educations that you would need to do that. So yeah, like in the first intermediate period, we know that there were a number of warring factions, people vying for power. The kind of districts got broken up between different, essentially feudal lords, and multiple different claims to kingship. And then, eventually it all gets kind of reunified and stuff, under the it's the 12th dynasty, isn't it? Eventually that it happens. But again, haven't thought about this stuff in a long time. So but the we know that a lot of the limestone casing kind of ended up in Cairo in different buildings that were, there were huge building projects happening after the 7th century, as early, actually earlier as well, because the Greeks, even though they really well, they claimed to really respect the ancient ways of the Egyptians, but if you look at some of the way some of the generations of Greeks who were ruling in Alexandria under the Ptolemaic dynasty, so after, long story short, after Alexander the Great goes and conquers Persia basically, and kicks all of the current invading forces out of Egypt. He then takes over Egypt as the ruling god king and dies kind of shortly thereafter on another campaign out to India, right? And then he kind of leaves his empire to the fittest, essentially, to whoever can control it. Ptolemy the First, one of his generals, Ptolemy, decides to take Egypt, and he establishes a dynasty. So we're talking about what would this have been, around 300, so around the 4th century BC, and then, or 3rd century BC, and then we've got this line of Ptolemies who are ruling from Alexandria and not necessarily a part of the Egyptian population per se. They're just kind of, Alexandria is its own thing almost. It's quite a Greek city in Egypt, and they would have had access to all of this stuff. They had plenty of opportunity um, to take bits from elsewhere and pull them into the city and do stuff with them. So we see like some obelisks going missing from temples, ending up in Alexandria. So who knows what else they cannibalized at the time. But then, of course, you had Roman rule and then Arab rule. So it changed hands a number of times. And, you had Ottoman Empire as well and stuff like that. So like you've got all these different parties vying for control of the resources of the country,
Yeah.
any of whom and all of whom were interested in building their own stuff whilst they were there, understandably, because building stuff was the way you expressed power back in the day. And it's how you kind of, consolidated your power by going, this is my palace, this is my temple, these are the signifiers of my rule. And, I'm in charge now, I'm the boss now.
When you mentioned earlier about like cattle, so that means they had to have farmland. So
Mhm.
it's not a conspiracy or a crazy idea that there obviously was water that was found in Egypt. Um,
The Nile is the source of basically all the water in Egypt. They had to irrigate the Nile.
but when most people think of Egypt, they think of just sand and they think of the pyramids, obviously. But
Mhm.
I'm wondering, were there large areas of farmland, and would that, because I look at like there's a movie called Year One with Jack Black. It's a crazy funny movie, but it's dumb to get any knowledge or information on it. But when they start questioning if there has to be something beyond that, I start looking at that. That's when some of this limestone, if it wasn't taken over or conquered or taken from another civilization, was ended up being traded. And this is how in history we have a lot of things that ended up somewhere that shouldn't, weren't even known to that location, was from
Mm.
trading. So I'm wondering if that was from a farm hand or if that was from someone that just decided to explore past what they could see and see if that goes even farther. And that's where I get a little bit interested in, is that thinking. Because when we talk about like the idea that like maybe there was a bunch of people rioting that wanted to take down the pyramid, it's just an idea. It's not fact, obviously, but that's we see that shit happen today. And I know we can't base societal thinking off that, but that's kind of how history is kind of gone. There's primal things or just random above the age thinkers. Leonardo da Vinci can be one of them based on his time period. There's always this type of person that is thinking something different. And it's not for us a very, very advanced idea to think that someone would just be like kicked out and explore a little bit past whatever that simulation
Mm.
goes. But
Yeah.
I don't know if that's too advanced for that primitive style, but they did amazing things in comparison when we look at they were primitive back then by maybe sacrificing or ripping out a heart or whatever it is. They were still very, very advanced when it came to the type of art that they left behind in a form of history, the type of education. There had to be some type of education, like you were mentioning before, about talking about maybe the nobles looking at a bunch of people that were maybe sparking up or making work outside. If I was lived in a mansion my whole entire life and I saw a bunch of people just like, dancing on the street, I'd be like, they're peasants. You know what I mean? So it's not different than how we look at now. It's just that things around us have really evolved our thinking in a way that is a little bit different, but there's still some primal basic knowledge foundations or footsteps that we are still following in such a way where it's kind of linked to back then as a little bit as well too.
Yeah, there's a common thread of of humanity and human behavior. And we all have that. I think it's fair to say that, we share a survival instinct and a desire for freedom, probably across all millennia. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Like the Egyptians were, especially for their time, a very advanced people. And we know conceptually they were an interesting kind of advanced people, even though it's advanced in a way that a different way to how we think about advancement. Like we think about advancement being, we have these medicines and we have these sciences and we can calculate these things and we can make robots and crap like that. And the Egyptians were advanced in the way that they conceived of the world and the way that they developed responses, technological responses to their problems. That's just how societies tend to work, like you say. So yeah, like their problems were hashtag Egypt problems, hashtag Pharaoh's problems, like, and they would have definitely had, like I said, periods where Pharaoh would have been unjust, nobles would have been unjust, taxes would have been too high. Yes, there was quite a lot of agriculture. There's a very verdant strip either side of the Nile that was irrigated. And there are some theories that the centralization of power actually happened because the Pharaoh at the time, or rather the chief or tribe leader at the time, who could control the Nile and access to the water from the Nile, was the one that ended up in charge. So if you started like controlling the irrigation of all the farmers over the country, if you started figuring out, well, we're going to cut off water here, and I have enough manpower to do that, for instance, then you're in charge, because no one can grow anything. So it's interesting to think about how the centralization of power happened when there was no quote unquote military industrial complex, right? It's like the idea of mass slavery in ancient Egypt doesn't really work without social control because there's no automatic weapons, there's no guns. The pyramids weren't built by slaves. People were paid to build them. Now, whether that pay and that lifestyle was rewarding enough that it was truly their choice is something we can't glean from the record, but we could probably say, well, it looks like a really hard life, but it does look like they were really well fed. So it looks like they're being compensated quite well for what they're doing. That's interesting because it implies that maybe there was some choice and that some people would choose this life and to settle in this town and build pyramids rather than take their chances trying to produce crop and knowing that if the Nile doesn't get the annual Nile flood, because it didn't always happen, the inundation didn't always happen. You have the blue Nile and the white Nile and they meet. And every year there's supposed to be an inundation, but some years there wasn't enough rainfall, usually around the kind of be like Ethiopia. If there wasn't enough rainfall there, then the Nile didn't inundate further north because it flowed from south to north, contrary to how we think about Upper and Lower Egypt.
Yeah.
Upper Egypt is southern and Lower Egypt is northern, and it meets the Mediterranean. So there's a lot of kind of practical geographical aspects to how this civilization evolved, and we can see that in the symbolism. But equally, there's a lot of kind of mystical stuff in their symbolism as well. And it's really interesting when you look at both comparatively and go, these gods exist because they needed a flood and they needed to appeal to someone for that flood to happen. These gods existed because childbirth was dangerous and they wanted protection in the home. These demons existed because they couldn't explain how these maladies happened. So they gave them names and drew pictures of them, and they were things that brought you nightmares or sickness. And these rituals existed to counter those demons, except they started developing technological ways of dealing with them by using certain substances like alchemy, alchemet of Kemet, which is the original name for Egypt.
What do you think the major shift was that really just I don't know, I wouldn't say died out or kind of ended this whole entire era where we don't see a lot of our buildings being like pyramids now? Like, why didn't that take over more farther? Like, because I've been talking to people that study like Roman history, Greek history, Norse mythology, and it always seems to be like a giant prior of psychedelics or some type of drug that really brought the spirituality and kind of boosted it in such a way. And it's like, you wonder what we're missing in society today. Like everyone talks about how why is the world just gone to like shit? Why is it none of this? I think it's a multitude of factors, but I look at the factor of like, we still have religion, we still have government, but we still don't have psychedelics. Now, I'm not a psychedelic person myself, but I look at the concept of that boosts spirituality. A lot of these religious texts, even was it Graham Hancock that talked about finding in the inside of a chalice of some of these remnants was like LSD or some type of peyote, I think it was, that was stuck inside of these.
Oh, I've heard about that. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm just curious to see if it was the drop off of psychedelics or maybe this hindrance of this type of drug that people lost in touch of spirituality. I mean, eventually we evolve past spirituality to use technology and find scientific methods behind the brain, and then people still want to say, no, well, it's God, it's unexplainable. Okay, that's cool. You believe that? I'm gonna check this out over here. But I look at like that was a major influence in so many civilizations, and with Norse mythology, they just totally spaced it out. They didn't talk about the Vikings taking fly agaric mushrooms. That's something you have to really learn on your own time. They don't teach that in the history books. All they teach you is about pillaging, and you don't realize the advancement of that culture in a whole. And I was just wondering if there was any talks of psychedelic medicines or psychedelic drugs that people were taking in Egypt that there seemed to be a branch off with.
I think the short answer to that is
No.
entirely likely.
Okay.
Is it right? So yes, and I'm kind of with you on the idea of psychedelics playing a role beyond recreational, in so much as we can see
Because if I take
therapeutic
mushrooms, I'm
use.
gonna see a fucking jackal head on a person. I can tell you that
Right,
much.
right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, like some of the imagery that we find, for instance, in some of the imagery of the Book of the Dead, for example, and even the pyramid texts, which are the oldest texts, religious texts that we have, really, possibly the oldest religious texts in the world, if I remember rightly. These things were seen by the Victorians who discovered them, who were looking at them through a very kind of Christianized lens, as gobbledygook, right? Because they couldn't understand what they were interpreting. If you re-examine those things in the light of, well, it's basically taking an open mind and saying, well, what concepts are they getting at here? You find something that's a bit more shamanic in a way. And even though that's not quite the right terminology, because shamanic really means anything kind of post Upanishads and stuff like that. It's still something that alludes to some kind of out of body experience potentially. I do touch on this a little bit actually in Profane Egyptologists, because there's some kind of discussion of Jeremy Nadler's work where he finds shamanic wisdom in the pyramid texts, is one of his books. And it's entirely likely that various substances, and I can't remember the names off the top of my head, were being used in ritual in ancient Egypt. Now, is that the only cause for the changes we see? No, of course not. There's huge social, political, military, geographical causes for the end of, to come back to your original question, the end of the pyramid age. Really, the pyramid stopped being built because centralized government realized they were a real drain on resources, had collapsed. The previous dynasties had ushered in what we call the first intermediate period, where there's no, I put that in air quotes for anyone on audio, where there's no centralized government and kind of quote unquote chaos ruled. And these were generally seen by people in authority as bad times. And the people in authority want good times. So they go back to, when they go back to monumental building, instead of just honoring the king, they start honoring the gods. And we see more temples happening, and we see the kings being honored in their honoring of the gods. So it becomes a different expression of political power, but it's still an expression of political power in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And why does that change? Well, that changes because cultural values change. As different groups, so as the Greeks came in, the cultural values changed, and you see the gods being worshipped start to change. And I think you would then start to see eventually the rituals of Egypt themselves changing, because really what's happening is the temples that were no longer, so the religious center moved around Egypt numerous times, and the gods that were in favor, we generally see are connected to whatever area and whatever dynasty is connected to the god of those priesthoods. And that's where we see the religious center for a different period change. So it moves around, and it goes from Cairo, like Heliopolis, down to Thebes, and moves down. And that means that the political landscape is changing at that period in time, right? So if a bunch of people come in, say from Greece, who are ruling the country from Alexandria, well, of course, there's less resources going to the temples down in Thebes, for instance. There's less money going to them, there's less tax going to them. And so the motivation to be a priest and to maintain those rituals, unless you're extraordinarily devoted, and there's, to be fair, a lot of evidence for piety and personal faith in ancient Egypt, even though some Egyptologists, I mean, that's something that Egyptologists are still debating to this day, but there's plenty of evidence to say that there were individuals who had faith in those gods. But as a career choice, it becomes a different question. Can I still be a priest and undertake these rituals realistically when all the money's now up north in Alexandria? Or do I go up to Alexandria and try and join the priesthood there, or do something different? Either way, you're not partaking in those original rituals anymore, and you're not partaking in whatever concoctions may have been used in said rituals. Because we know that, again, alchemy comes from the name of Egypt, Alchemet. So we know that there was use of substances. We don't know if it was recreational per se, other than alcohol was definitely used in recreational ways which were tied to ritual. But what we can see is almost certainly there would have been a change in those practices as the economic landscape changes and the religious landscape, which is inherently tied to the state at the time, changes with it. So that's a really long way to answer your question. Sorry, dude. But yeah.
Do you think when the power kind of went from building these pyramids for one person and then it got involved to building pyramids for a god or for the gods up above, do you think was because the transition of power? Like a king has power for sure, but a god, if you're looking to something that you can't see, there is no face to it, but it creates such magnificent supernatural things such as rain, such as
Mm-hmm.
earthquakes,
Mm-hmm.
storms, whatever you want to call it. Do you think that that kind of was a way of someone who was in power noticing the shift happening and being able to be like, hey, we can still build these things? Or do you think it was a more of a community aspect with the way that people were thinking? Is that because if you're building something for a king, you're like, well, it's for this fucking guy. But if you're building something for a god, religion is like that still today. People will do things in the name of God. People do things in the name of religion. It's much harder to do something in the name of whoever you're talking about, one singular person, but someone that
Mm-hmm.
is someone you can't see, something that's omnipotent, something that is unexplainable. It's
Mm-hmm.
much easier to break your fucking back or slip a disc when you're putting blocks down.
I think you've hit on a really, really important point there, and it's a very accurate assessment in a lot of ways, because the change in power between just the pharaoh and the priesthood is noticeable over the span of Egyptian history. So we get to like the Middle Kingdom, and the power of the priesthood has increased massively. And there were reasons for that. You know, the parts of the reasons for that were that the just in the same way that the church kind of gobbled up land in medieval Britain, you know, the taxes essentially that were paid, well, you had donations from the pharaoh to the servants of the gods for the temple, and so the servants of the gods at the temple ended up, you know, whoever was running the temples in ancient Egypt, they became responsible for an awful lot of the land's wealth because they had these donations, quote unquote, coming in, land set aside for growing crop, so that the political and the religious kind of theocratic systems were linked in like this and supporting each other. And that way, we see that the priesthood ends up influencing the way that the kingship plays out. And we see that happening no more clearly than when Akhenaten tries to usurp and invert the religious paradigm of Egypt by talking about the Aten and bringing in a kind of form of proto-monotheism almost. And the priesthood of Amun respond after his death by changing the name of his son from Tut-Aten into Tut-Ankh-Amun, who of course becomes one of the most famous pharaohs in all of history, if only because his tomb was intact where others weren't. So yes, absolutely. We definitely see evidence of the conception and the power of priesthood changing over time. where originally it was just Pharaoh, and Pharaoh was essentially God on earth, in the same way that some places still conceive of their ruler as being, you know, the intermediary to God. Pharaoh was literally conceived of as a god. But of course, after several generations of Pharaoh dying, you know, or getting sick and being interred, eventually you have to accept and adapt and go, okay, Pharaoh is God on earth as a representation of divine kingship and rulership. However, we're not going to just build tribute to Pharaoh, even though they still did that in like statues and monuments and stuff like that. What we're going to do is we're going to represent and emphasize the Pharaoh with the gods, donating to the gods, you know, in the name, and we make all of our donations and our prayers to the gods via the Pharaoh. Hotep Dinisu is a hieroglyphic Egyptian formula, which is an offering on behalf of the king. And that's how almost all offering stelae from the ancient world open, with this Hotep Dinisu formula, an offering the king gives. Whoever's giving the offering, it's an offering the king's giving to the gods. So the pharaoh's still this intermediary, but absolutely, as you say, the priesthood is becoming much more powerful and much more responsible for a lot of the wealth and the grain and all of that stuff that Egypt's got. And so it kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
Weren't you telling me about the priest that was willing to sacrifice himself for people to get rain? And then I forgot something happened right before, and then rain happened. There was some
Wasn't
type.
me.
Okay, I was saying I heard somebody mention something to me before about a priest that was, I forgot, he was willing to sacrifice himself for the people to get rain or something like that. And then right as he was about to sacrifice himself, um, rain happened, and he talked about it was a sign that he was the prophet, or he was this uh, word of God in a way.
That's one of those kind of cool story bro moments, isn't
That's what I'm saying. I was like, I want to know if that shit's real. I was like, because I
it?
had a person who was leaving Mormonism many times in his life, and he finally eventually did. But he was telling me that there was 3 times he was looking for faith, and at this point in life, when you're about to lose religion and you're looking for any sign, then anything can become a sign for to
Hmm.
stay in that religion. And he had multiple encounters. I was like, yeah, that is a crazy thing, but it's just you're making it crazy because you're already looking for something to keep you holding on to that. And I was wondering about that story because I think for a lot of people, like that's obviously it's just a coincidence moment. They'd be like, oh, it's raining now. It's obviously not anything different, but I don't know. This is just fascinating to me. I was like, I thought it was you that told me that a while ago. I'm trying to remember back from our first episode. I didn't listen back to it, but I'm from everything talking, especially you're in like the same room too, so I'm able to fucking get those flashbacks and stuff. But yeah, man. I mean, it's because the psychedelics thing, from learning more and more and more, I've heard from different areas, and it just seems like it makes a lot of sense, especially when you're talking about religion became a little bit more powerful. The priest eventually starts to let that power go to his head, and you start seeing a lot of things. More people are willing to sacrifice or give anything that they want, just for maybe something for themselves, if they just give it to the priest and the priest can communicate it to the god above. uh yeah, but I think you answered most of my questions when it came to like the pyramids. That's
I mean, there's more detail on that on Listenable. Shameless plug. I've got a whole course
Yeah,
on
let,
pyramids
let
on
people know where they can
Listenable.
hear you.
Yeah. I mean, there's the course on Listenable, which is an audio platform, which is like, you know, just audio courses, short lessons, 10 minutes long. There's like 10 episodes, I think, of that, which is all about the evolution of mastabas, tomb spaces, grave pits, mastabas, step pyramids, true pyramids, how the pyramids came about, and then it counters some of the kind of conspiracy theory and alternative Egyptology in that course as well. And I kind of wish I'd reread it so I could give you some more specifics, but it's all there. I mean, it's all, you know, it's all done. But the human brain is a funny old thing, you know. You kind of, if the more information you take in, the more just self deletes, and I'm having to refresh myself all the time. So, I mean, one of the things I've kind of done is moved away from academic Egyptology, more, you know, naturally anyway, because of the way that the field has gone, as we touched on. So I'm no longer really, technically, I'm not an academic anymore per se. You know, like I have a PhD and I've done all the reading and I've checked all the boxes, and I have several friends who are still working in the field. And I occasionally kind of talk and communicate with the field and do things with them. But increasingly, I'm kind of more in an entrepreneurial space where I'm actually just writing and trying to put out courses and stuff like that. And so I'm finding that you know what it's like when you must find this doing your podcast as well, when you're getting new information in all the time, it's pushing other stuff out, especially once you're in your 40s, and you know there's just too much information in there. Something has to go. So
I mean, you
yeah.
got the Profane podcast. That's a great name, is what I'm talking about. That's you got that name.
Yeah,
So I'm like, you might
thanks,
as
man.
well. And I think what's good, even the good part about you not being really what you would say as a specific academic is the
Mm.
factor of you don't have any worry about what words come out of your mouth, that you can truly freely speak. You don't know how many conversations I've had with academics from any type of course you can name. I've talked to someone in that field, even at one point I was going to talk to someone who was researching badger fucking, but that went down the drain. But it gets that specific on things, and you got to realize
Yeah.
like there's a couple people that, like, I can't say this. And I'm like, you understand that in the world right now, that anybody's career, anybody's life goals, even the pandemic should have showed you that everything is so sensitive and you can lose it just like that. You might as
Yep.
well do as much as you possibly can. And sadly, what gets more people's attention is when an academic or someone comes on and teaches these things, but not in the strict school manner. They want it fucking hitting you with fun facts. They want you hitting it with something fun or do some type of stupid thing, or just being outright with it. Like, hey, no, the fucking earth's not flat. Let's get to this. And then you understand it gets a little bit deeper because now you're talking like how they would talk to a friend at a bar. And that's the best way I soak up information, is by having someone like yourself on my show and giving me your time to be able to talk about some things that are up in my head and learn a little bit too, because you soak up more information when it's more acceptable to your ears. And what's acceptable
Mm.
to my ears is just talking to you one on one. I You want to talk about a cure for academic studies? I said that'll happen when I can get an anthropologist and a person who studies indigenous studies in a room together without them fucking tearing each other apart. Because it never happens. They have two conflicting things. One person wants the other person to understand that this course of history went this way and that people need to pay and apologize for all that. The other person goes, you can't hold that at that time because that's the time thinking. That's not necessarily every person now's thinking. We've evolved from that, and we cannot forget that. But science right now is on the chopping block. Any type of academic really is on the chopping block on a concept of what's going to be next. It could be archaeology one minute and then it's going to be something else the next, because people don't like history, and they don't like it because they don't like how the way it's aged. And I would
Hmm.
just like, if you're just blunt about it, you should be happy that it pisses you off, because now it shows that you've evolved as a person. And that's the best way you can get a bunch of social justice warriors on your side, is by just saying, yeah, we don't think like that anymore. I watched Steven Crowder trying to rationalize Thanksgiving to a bunch of people, like prove me wrong type things. And I'm like, he's not wrong, but he's a dick the way he's coming off. And it's like, it's not really about the thing of that, but the 50 years of peace that came afterwards. The fact that you
Hmm.
should be thankful for what you have in your life. And I thought that was important to highlight, because that's not what gets talked about every single time. It's about, you know what Christopher Columbus did? I'm like, all right, I don't have to apologize for Christopher Columbus just because of my color of my skin. But people want that. And I look at it like, I don't know where science is going to end up going to, but I feel like academics like you, or you're still an academic whether you're not active in it or not, you still have so much knowledge into your head that can be given to a bunch of people, and you're charismatic. So I mean, I'd love to have you back on my show, like I said, just talk. And if anything, I'll send me those listenable things that you're talking about. I can link it to the episode for other people out there listening to, and I can also do
Appreciate that,
some
man. Thank
research
you.
on my own and be able to study a little bit, and then have you back on and talk on more specific topics so you can explain a whole bunch about them and get some notes lined up and everything, even though I don't like notes. But I think it's important, because anybody out there listening right now to this episode is gonna be like, I never knew any of this stuff. It's like, no, because Egypt's so far away, nobody talks about it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're more focused on like what happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago, not what happened 2000 years ago. I go, well, that's the best place to start, is 2000 years ago or however long
Mhm.
ago, because it's not fresh. It's not going to hurt you when you find out that George Washington's teeth weren't made of cherry wood; they were made of slave teeth. It's 1,000% easier on the burns. You know what I'm saying? So it's just easier to educate on a more conversational platform and be able to realize that, like, an academic, like, you didn't, throughout this whole entire episode, you never talked down to me. And I think that's one of the main things that a person needs to do to be able to educate people or even be able to talk to someone. Is most of the world is focused on talking down or shaming someone because I don't want to hear what you have to say. This is what I believe and this is what's right. You're wrong. And it's constantly that. And I'm like, that's not how we work together as a community. It's not how the world has gotten to the place that it's gotten to. It's now falling
Yeah.
apart because of that thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, one of the things I always wanted to, there's another one of those sides, but one of the things I always wanted to do, you can tell I'm just old and tired now, but one of the things I always wanted to do was try and get people talking again instead of mischaracterizing each other and assuming they knew what the other person was going to say and then talking over them. Like that's been happening in every field, in every, you know, political and historical, and every response to that has seems to have been conflicted rather than constructive. And we can do a lot more good by trying to understand the point that and the need that the other party has and going, okay, I see where you're coming from. And here's either the stuff that supports that or here's the stuff that refutes that. But whichever way it lands, it shouldn't matter. Like, I don't have a dog in that fight, you know? And I guess that speaks to what you're saying as well, is that part of the thing about ancient history is that we can be a little bit more abstract and a little bit more objective about it. But equally, I am seeing increasingly, much to my chagrin, the projection of modern values onto the ancient world. And you know what? Like when I was in academia, I was encouraged to use certain lenses through which to view the ancient world. And some of those things came from, you know, like Gramsci and Marxism and stuff like that, because they're ways of analyzing power, essentially. But the thing that I always tried to bear in mind whilst I was doing that was that this is a lens and these are theories and these deconstructions can't be applied everywhere. Do you know what I mean? Like this is just theory making. Like we can't just go and project this into the world everywhere suddenly. Like this isn't the key to everything. This is just an idea, a model through which to view something. And I think part of the problem that we're getting at the moment is that people are taking those ideas or those cultural lenses and then thinking they've got the key to reality and applying them to everything. So, you know, if you use if you're educated in postmodernist theory, for instance, or post-Marxism or any of those things in a university, or you are, you know, reading the work of someone who's using that as a lens, you then go out onto the world and project it onto everything. What happens when you project one lens onto everything? Well, there's exactly the same thing that the Christians did back when they were interpreting the ancient Egyptians through a Christian lens. They misinterpreted it, or they only saw what they were looking for. Like you say, you go out looking for one thing through a particular lens, you'll find it probably, but it might not have been there without you doing that. So yeah, it's becoming an increasingly difficult topic, the ancient world, as different groups try to lay claim to um not necessarily ownership, but heritage of, and then cultural ownership becomes a question, and then abstract things like slavery in the ancient world start kind of sparking and triggering conversations and stuff like that. And people get very emotionally connected to those things. And I think one of the most useful things we can do in those situations is take a breath and step back and go, well, hold up a second. Like, first, we don't know per se, you know, like traditionally speaking, we don't really know what the numbers were of these practices and how this would have shook down. And we've got very few kind of individual accounts of what was happening here. But we're building a picture out of a jigsaw of like scraps of evidence. And we probably should be really, really wary about projecting our own modern ideological models onto those things and making value judgments attached to those things rather than trying to understand those people on their own terms, which I think is really the goal, right? Is that we try and understand ancient cultures on their terms without bringing in modern moral judgments about them. Like I'm seeing some moral judgment about the idea of kingship starting to come up in my field. And it's like, well, okay, but this was the first, or certainly one of the first nations to ever experiment with that idea. If you now bring 5,000 years of reflection onto power hierarchies and kingship and patriarchies and all that stuff and project that onto the ancient world, then you're going to start distorting our actual understanding of it objectively because you're viewing it through those lenses. So they're tools and they're useful tools, don't get me wrong. Like it can be very useful to look at the way that power dynamics might have played out in the ancient world, for instance, between different groups and different like religious groups, for instance, or different genders, or any of those things. And it's like, yeah, those are tools and they're interesting. They're not the final word. They're not the key to life. They are theoretical models. And we need to kind of remember that, and exactly like you say, not just presume we've got the right of it and everyone else has got the wrong of it because they're using a different lens. It's like, no, like, just accept that you're using a theoretical model. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And we don't know the truth, so we probably shouldn't get angry about that.
Yeah. Well, Paul, I appreciate you for doing my podcast again. I'd love to get you back on. Like I said, I want to listen over to some of that stuff that you were talking about before. As you said, listenables.
Listen, I've got a course on Listenable. I think the first class is free. The first one is actually free on my YouTube as well. So one of the things I didn't mention was that I've tied up the audio version of my podcast. Maybe we'll talk about that next time. But everything is on YouTube now. Profane Egyptology. It's all on YouTube now. And moving forward, all of the new episodes that are coming in fall for season 3 going onwards will be YouTube. So that's where I'll be.
Well, while we're on air, I might as well do it. I'm going to hit the subscribe button.
Thank you. Appreciate that, man.
And it's not the Profane History podcast, or it is?
It used to be the Profane Humanities podcast, but that has gone. That is now retired. And it's Profane Egyptology over on YouTube right now. I may expand it out past Egypt eventually, but I'm just kind of focusing on the cool stuff that I like, that I'm kind of known for.
Subscribe. 22 episodes or 22 videos.
There we go. That's the one. It's small but growing.
Bump up those subscriber numbers. People follow them, subscribe to the show. I'll make sure I link it in the show notes. Is there anything, Paul, you want to say before we wrap up the show?
Thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate it. And, I can get passionate and ramble a little bit, so sorry about that. But
it's a
it was really fun.
Experience for me.
Cool. Man, it was really fun. Really fun being on. It's always fun talking to you. So
thank you for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.